I'm going to make this introduction as short as possible to make sure we have enough time for the interview. Hashim Sarkis is the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning here at MIT. Prior to that, Hashim was at Harvard's GSD as the Aga Khan Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism. In parallel, Hashim is also the principal architect in the Cambridge and Beirut-based firm Hashim Sarkis Studio. Hashim wears many different hats as a dean, an educator, a practitioner, a writer, or to sum it up, an architect. I'd like to give Hashim a personal introduction before we begin. Question not only the wall, but what's behind it. Question not only the material, but its political implication. Question not only the what, but the how, who, when, and why. Questioning architecture is an architect's rite of passage, but Hashim doesn't take this responsibility lightly. I can't think of a better person to help us take down this wall and through the constantly in flux path of architecture. Hashim, thank you for making the time to sit down with me today. I know you're extremely busy.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin by asking you, what do you believe was your first project?
What I believe was my first project was actually my first project, which is the housing for the fishermen in the city of Tyre, Sur, south of Lebanon. This was a commission that I received from an NGO called the Association for Development of South Lebanon to help house a community of fishermen who were living in the historic city of Tyre outside the city because the city became congested and because it was a World Heritage Site, they could not build there anymore. So it was about selecting the site, working with them to figure out the best strategy, and then ultimately go through the design process with them and get it built. The process lasted about 10 years from beginning to end.
Design as value added to a product is a phrase you've referred to. How do you define design?
Design is the process by which we improve the interface between human beings and their environment. The notion of the value added is one that I believe is coming out recently by way of the interest of the business community in design, seeing it as being an asset and understanding its material value added to products. I think our understanding of design should be broader, and it predates this understanding of design and hopefully is going to survive it.
Architecture education has gone through much scrutiny. How does MIT view the role of the architectural education?
MIT will be celebrating 150 years of architecture education here. We're the oldest school of architecture in the country. We're also the youngest in the sense that we are constantly rethinking it and imagining it in different contexts. Architecture education has always been a form of apprenticeship, and probably in the early days at MIT it was that. But increasingly, MIT has developed, over the years, MIT has developed a model which I can call the MIT model of teaching architecture, which is borrowing from the sciences and technology in how it defines areas of expertise in architecture and going very deeply into them, but also highlighting the importance of the architect as the synthesizer among these different areas of expertise, and working both vertically in a way in expertise depth and horizontally across, using design as a form of synthesis between them. But more recently also, I think the idea that design itself could become an area of research and investigation has come up, and I believe that it is an experimentation that is quite strong here at MIT. I also believe that there's a very beautiful tension, a productive one, between the space of teaching architecture in the studio and the space of teaching architecture in the laboratory, and how these two models can converge is what we're working on here at MIT.
Okay. I want to ask you about the ostrich-peacock dilemma that you've described as two horrendous positions that architects place themselves in. Why is it horrendous? And is it our mission to try and strike a balance?
Did I use the word horrendous?
Yes.
Okay. Well, what I find unproductive about them is that the ostrich is basically an approach whereby you try to embed architecture or let it disappear into its context, or rather thinking that by making it blend with the surroundings it will disappear. And the peacock is that by separating itself with its pomposity, it will actually transform the context around it. These two attitudes towards context I find to be problematic. Maybe horrendous is not the right word. Problematic in the first case because it takes away from architecture its ability to transform context. And in the second, it takes context out of architecture. And I do believe in the transformative role of architecture, and I find that those two positions are shortchanging that possibility. And these are two extreme, obviously polemicized positions which do not exist in their extremity within architecture, but I use it as a polemic.
In talking about bigness, you've said that it's reached its limits of elasticity. Is there a certain scale limitation that architects can or should operate in?
Bigness has reached its limit of elasticity in practical ways. By that I mean that the notion of bigness as articulated by Koolhaas was an accurate observation of the scale of projects that were being put in front of architects. And as such, were defying that conventional relationship between architecture and context that had been developed and articulated from the 60s up to the 80s, let's say. And when scale started growing, it became clear that those conventions of how architecture relates to context were being challenged. But up to the recent recession, that scale kept growing and growing until what architects were doing was essentially building cities instantly as buildings. And therefore, even though the relationship between those projects and their context was what Koolhaas was referring to, but internally architecture was beginning, within the scope of the project, was beginning to act as context. And therefore, that notion of the reason I used the term that it has reached its limit of elasticity was precisely because of the fact that internally it had to now operate as context.
Data gathering and methods of information processing has been the focus of many in the quest for smart cities. Is that a valid urban tool?
Absolutely. And we are still at the very early stages of understanding its utility. Whether current practices, visualization, spatialization of the data are leading to the right outcomes, it's not clear. It's still an early period, but I completely believe in the value of data, not only in better understanding the contexts in which we're operating, but also in being able to measure the impact of what we do. There's a lot of work to be done. It's a very early moment, but it's a very exciting moment.
You would like to change what we talk about when we talk about the city. Where would you like to lead this discussion?
The terms, vocabulary that we use to describe cities is still very much based on the metropolitan radial model of city organization. City centers, the downtown is the heart, in a ring, a suburban ring, and then a rural distribution, and perhaps some satellite settlements. If we look at most of the urban settlements today, probably many of them had origins in this model, but this model has transformed, has changed radically in many contexts. And we're beginning to see formations that are regional, trans-regional, that do not follow that model, but follow other parameters. In my research group here at MIT, we're looking at these trans-regional models and what patterns, what morphologies they generate. And even though they do carry some of the DNA of the metropolitan in them, but they have other new genetic formations that we're trying to analyze.
Environmental issues are important to you. Is it a vehicle to project inception, or is it something that is integrated into the design at a later stage?
I would like to think about it as being what Alejandro Aravena talks about as being common sense. as an integral part of the common sense that we use when we're designing. We may have to, in many cases, amplify its impact, its presence, to become part of the expression and the message, particularly in times of imminent crisis that we're talking about today. How much can architecture take on the responsibility in order to come back with solutions is still not clear to us. There's plenty of evidence that we contribute to a huge part of the carbon footprint on Earth, and it's part of our responsibility, therefore, to reduce that. But I do not want it to become a call for being zealots about it. We need to be actively involved and deeply involved, critically involved, and as such, it might need to be seen as part of a mission today to amplify also expressively our participation in this process.
Many of your projects have interesting site/ground conditions. How do your buildings sit on their ground?
I'd like to think of how I work with the relation between architecture and ground as also being how I work between architecture and sky. And I work a lot on calibrating the relationship between four lines that architecture produces. One is the ground line. One is an elevated line, the ground that is constructed, whether it is sitting 5 feet above ground or a whole floor above ground. It makes a big difference. How architecture lifts you from the context or carves you into the context. And then the third line being the horizon line, and how by pulling it in from a distance or creating a sense of depth, architecture transforms this context. And then the fourth line is the skyline, how architecture meets the sky. And the relationship between these four lines is what makes every building.
What are the roles of material versus finish in your built work?
That's a tough one. It's a tough one because not all projects start by thinking about them through materials. Actually, hardly any start with the material as being predetermined. But I would like to think of materials and finishes as being part of something that eventually happens in every project, which is arriving at the moment where a very specific construction node is formed. And by node, I mean the intersection of many factors in the building around a construction challenge or problem or solution, eventually solution. In conventional architecture thinking, that is understood as being a tectonic approach to design. But it is not a node that informs every aspect of the building. It becomes a heightened moment in the building that is about construction. Materials enter there, finishes enter there. So rather than thinking about them as separate elements, I think about them as being, or they usually emerge as being part of that knot, part of that tectonic moment.
A lot of importance is placed on researching your project's context. Can you clarify your idea of the object-context relationship?
I think of architecture as being transformative of context. So the idea of context as a given and architecture as fitting in it is one I would like to challenge. I think of every building as being at once responding to context and taking us out of context. And how to calibrate this is the art of every building.
You've been interested in the issue of representation in architecture. Do these issues come in the form of drawings, buildings, or words?
It comes in all of the above. I've always been interested in methods of representation of buildings in forms of projection. I'm also interested in architecture as a form of representation. But increasingly, I have become interested in architecture as being a host of the other arts. And by that, I mean that contrary to much of what is going on today, or let's say in contrast, and instead of architecture becoming itself all-inclusive of being sculpture, being representation, being form, and being architecture, meaning instead of this obsessive way of integrating every aspect of our lives and all forms of art into the architecture, I prefer to think of architecture as being able to provide a framework for the other arts to reside in it, so that a building could create space for inscription, could create space for the graphic, could create space for painting or photography, rather than it trying to be all of the above at the same time.
What function does beauty or aesthetics play in architecture?
Huge one. A huge one in the sense that part of the ability of architecture to transform is its ability to seduce. And beauty's one main function is its seduction. How to instrumentalize that is always very difficult, because some aspects of that we can anticipate, but others have their own ability to inspire the world. And it is in that possibility, the open-endedness of the impact of beauty, its inspirational outcomes, that architecture plays an important role, or that architecture should benefit from playing a role.
As someone who has the unique position to operate at a high caliber when it comes to discourse and practice, could you describe the most significant clashes and intersections between the two?
I don't know if it's high caliber, but it's intense. Increasingly, I feel that one of the biggest challenges for us between education and practice is how to create the frameworks of knowledge that will be able to address emerging problems without those frameworks becoming too rigid that they no longer correspond to the problems at hand. That phase or lag effect between the two is what preoccupies me quite a bit these days.